fantastic. Welcome, everyone. We have a very exciting panel. I'm joined by a panel of all-stars to talk about Web3 today. So we're going to cover a couple of interesting questions that you might have. And we're going to not only talk about what Web3 is, what are the applications, but we're also going to talk a bit about the impact of the current environment of Web3, if there is any. So let me start off, and a warm welcome to my panelists, with maybe a first question on what is Web3 and what are you most excited about? And maybe, Basil, if we can start with you.
Sure. So the way I think about Web3 is the ownership and ability for individuals and institutions to monetize their digital property or their data. And I think this is really important going into the future, treating data as a commodity that can be essentially used to build an economy around.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, ultimately, fundamentally, what Web3 is underpinned by is the blockchain technology that enables digital asset ownership, right? Within that, then you own a piece of your identity. Identity then becomes your creativity, culture, and you have industries and virtual societies that build upon that. Now, if you look at where the space is today, with 80-some million wallets, it's sort of compared to the internet. At a time in mid-90s, it's about the same number of users. And now it's 5 billion, right? So the third iteration of the internet is very powerful. As you can see what happened in Web 2 when the whole everybody can publish, it really transformed industries, right? You know, newspaper businesses sort of transform itself, data becomes a big thing. And with Web 3, when ownership then takes place, you know, you have a whole layer of transformation. You have all the identity pieces that will come out of it that would arise from enabling digital asset ownership.
Great. Kinga.
To me, Web3 is access. I agree with everything that Basil and Evan was saying about owning your digital identity, but at the same time, owning your creativity and have access and economics out of it, which we haven't done or haven't had a chance to do in Web 2 entirely. So I think at this point, when you're a tutor and you can go to a marketplace and sell your services, microservices as well for a few dollars, but you can make a living out of it, that's what Web3 can create for 1.7 billion people who currently are not able to access the entire infrastructure that we have in Web 2.
Great. I mean, there are a lot of interesting aspects. So let's pick up on some of them. So earlier this year in Davos, we had a long discussion around Web3 being the main driver to demonopolize Web 2 and everything that is wrong with Web 2. Would you agree with that?
I think that longer term, possibly. I think that's the intention, that's the goal, and that's what people kind of view it going to become. But I think that we're going to see other companies, usually venture-backed companies, grow and become, you know, quite dominant in the servicing space of Web3 infrastructure space. And I think it's just the paradigm will shift.
All right. Evan,
Well,
what's your view?
you know, the whole point about Web3 is democratizing, isn't it, right? Because what we're trying to do is that ultimately we have to understand that the data that we create, I mean, you know, all of you in the audience have a cell phone and you have a digital footprint. You're creating data every single day, right? That piece of data is very valuable because you're spending time with it ultimately, right? And should that be mined incessantly to be then centralized in databases that actually don't converse with one another, and then ultimately what you get back is a piece of advertising and sort of like, you know, how you're being shaped in sort of like, you know, likes and then all these interactions that you have is the only thing you'll get. That's not the commerce that we can imagine as we go forward, right? So the piece about democratizing the internet in this sense is really about how do I get my fair share of my data that I'm creating that are not actually being sort of, shall we say, extracted by companies, right? Because fundamentally, if you sort of look at what we're ultimately trying to create here, is that that valuable piece of the time that we're actually putting in ought to be we ought to be able to interact with other human beings in a very real way. And then when you put your creativity on, even folks like teachers, creators, musicians, you can imagine all these industries that can be transformed as a result of that kind of ownership. It's really powerful ultimately.
Interesting. King,
Right.
any comment on
Yeah,
that?
and I agree with everything. I think I wouldn't say it's a dominance play, it's more a natural evolution where we are today, right? And I think that's what's going to happen going forward. You're going to find use cases that are real use cases that are interesting, and they're just going to slowly take over what we see today as Web 2 and have a more immersive experience and have a more immersive experience in economics and just participation.
Okay, great. And then Evan, maybe let me follow up on that question. I mean, if we have the vision that Web3 is going to demonopolize, democratize Web2, do you think from a VC point of view, we're really decentralized, democratized, or are VCs already owning every bit and piece of Web3?
Yeah, that's sort of been talked about, hasn't it, right? What the VCs way in shaping the space, right? It's actually super interesting. So Animoca Brands itself is obviously funded by different funders very enthusiastically. But our sort of premise is that we're not going to be influenced by the capital that we draw on, right? Because ultimately, one very interesting piece of what we do is that we don't think about, hey, we have the money in here and these are the targeted returns, here's the ROI and all that stuff, because it's still early. What we're trying to do is that the money that you put into us, we're actually going to inject into ecosystems, and the ecosystem would pay back once we're able to create these interesting spaces, right? For instance, Sandbox, right? It's ultimately about creating really interesting social interactions in spaces. You're selling land, you're selling a token in there. What does it actually amount to? It's actually amounting to user-generated content, like in Roblox, but in the way that you own a piece of that particular content, right? When you decentralize the tokens, when you decentralize economies, it's no longer owned by Sandbox or Animoca. It's really owned by everyone else, right? And all we're doing is to facilitate the tools to build the economy up. So ultimately, all leads to decentralized autonomous organizations where the governance becomes decentralized, right? That's the best way of actually getting to the point where it's not the creators that originally conceived the concept that would monopolize how the space is going to go, or that particular even of that particular asset. It really is facilitation of the folks and the users that are actually ultimately on it. Going back to the VC's part, right? Fundamentally, we are somewhat acting like a VC sometimes as well, right? Because Animoca has 380 companies. The way we think about deploying that capital is that when we deploy capital to you, what are you building fundamentally? Is it valuable? Is it going to be, do you hold the same vision that we see in the philosophy that we see in actually giving a power to the communities? Or are you thinking about a quick out, a quick extraction, then pump the token and then go, right? So that's what we like to see, and then we want to see interoperability. Again, the whole piece of our creativity that we would like to see if there's space for you in there. Then the capital that we put into use is not going to be dictating them in a certain direction, nor do we like capital to dictate us in how we pursue our direction. So there's a difference here.
Interesting. Thanks for your view. Basil, I mean, we talked a lot about also the intersection between gaming and Web3, GameFi, and Evan just mentioned Roblox and Sandbox as an example. What gets you most excited about the opportunities in this intersection?
So I think personally, I have two subjects that I'm very nerdy about and passionate about. One is obviously corporate finance. I spent most of my career in that field in private equity and then moved into blockchain and crypto. But I'm also a hobby gamer, and I think it's something that's quite big in the region here, particularly because we can't go outside for half the year. And the intersection there is really a really interesting use case for one, adoption for the new generation, people getting used to the tools, understanding how to use them, then understanding how to monetize their data in a particular environment. But I think it also provides an interesting kind of example for how this could be applied to broader property, whether that's digital property or even physical property that can be traded digitally. And I think that's where it gets very interesting into the future.
Okay, interesting. And I mean, going more to the more traditional side of the view of Web3, I mean, Luca is taking a lot of care about the, let's say, accounting part and making everything proper. So if you look at the events that happened in the past 48, 72 hours, like how would you think this would affect Web3 going forward, and how important is proof of reliability?
I think we have to be very sober about the events that happened past 40, 72 hours, obviously. But I think as an infrastructure payer, an institutional infrastructure payer at Luca, we always been a believer in just generally in blockchain as an enabler of commerce. And in that sense, what we're trying to what always been trying to advocate is a responsible growth in the industry with transparency, auditability, accountability. And I think to the extent that there are players out there to support that, and generally the industry also supports that, I think it's sort of like a reawakening and resetting back to the principles of where we started out from, which is decentralized, transparent, permissionless, accessible. Those are the things that we need to focus on. And I think after this, I think the industry is going to emerge stronger. We're going to be more equipped to fight anything that's untoward and going towards a future where we can actually build access to people across the globe and create a future that is better and equalizing for everyone. And I think once we go back to that principle, I think everyone's going to realize the benefits of the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, it's I totally echo with what was just said, and I have great respect for the likes of Luca and the other infrastructure companies that's really actively building the space, because it's really the fundamental parts of how Web3 is going to thrive. If you look at what happened in the past week as things unfold, it really goes back to the basics, right? If you look at sort of when we talk about regulations, when we talk about just the basics of business ethics and all that, what's really happening is that there are just some basic layers of things that are not built yet for this fast space to grow. And that layer is underpinned by infrastructure, partially by working with regulatory authorities that really think through how the space ought to build in the first place. Because fundamentally, if you don't separate client assets, if you don't have risk management, you leverage like crazy, and there's no transparency in the process, of course things would happen, right? But what you have to get to the point is that we're trying to get to the point where there's more self-governance, but there is definitely going to be some dovetailing with regular, proven regulations as well. So, for instance, any brands would KYC, right? We were criticized for it, but before the other deed was actually dropped with Bored Ape Yacht Club, that's what we did, right? We believe that is a very important piece of actually understanding who your customer is when the asset is valuable. Then it is important that we pay attention to some of these issues that is tried and tested. Now, the concept, right, of Web3 about decentralizing is a noble one, but we have to recognize how new it is today, right? What I'm sort of feeling right now in terms of where the market is versus where the builders are coming in, there's still a lot of people and companies looking to enter the space as opposed to the ICO boom at the time, right? Now, some of you may recall in the late 90s and the early 2000s, whatever .com is worth, $100 million, right? And it ended up, doesn't matter what the .com is, it really matters what that underlying business is. We're going through similar stages in Web3, right? I truly believe that with all these entries, if all the companies looking to build on the metaverse, we'll see some great creativity. We'll see some companies that will succeed. We'll see some companies that would not succeed at the same time. But what ultimately it underpins all of this in digital asset ownership, we know it's real because of demographics, because of what the rising generation want in terms of spending 7 to 10 hours every day on the internet. They want to have a piece of that. They want to have that ownership, right? That part is clear.
Interesting. And Basil, you're very much entrenched in the startup ecosystem, particularly locally. So how would you see the impact of the events that happened on our ecosystem locally in terms of building, funding, and so on?
I think it definitely puts a bigger onus on regulation, and this really goes back to kind of why we started Midchains as a regulated first crypto exchange and custodian. So we wanted to build that infrastructure to enable firms to go out there and go into Web3 in some shape or form, however they choose. Ultimately, I think that transparency that's provided by being supervised by an external recognized authority is incredibly important as it relates to mitigating the risks that we've discussed here today, and I think that needs to continue.
All right, great. And I mean, if we look at the entire Web3 space, there are obviously some very exciting use cases that could happen, right? Let alone thinking about Web2 business model going into Web3. May I ask you just for one pick, like what would you think is one of the most exciting use cases in Web3 in the future that would drive adoption much further? And maybe we start, Kinga, with you.
Yeah, I'm pretty boring. I'm CFO, right? So I can't imagine anything beyond what's happening 5 days from now. But from my perspective, we've already seen very interesting use cases emerging in microfinance and international payments. And I think if you look around and you see that Ethereum processed about 4 times of Visa's transaction volume and surpassed the actual transaction size as well, that is incredibly empowering to see. Those to me is a killer app. I don't know what else you would call a killer app in such a short period of time taking over, and I think traditional finance is taking notice of that as well. I think this is the origin use case if you think about it, right? And I think it actually is working. So that to me is the next Web3 killer app, or existing killer app if you think about it.
Well, I do think that a lot of the existing applications that are being built today have not even come to fruition yet, right? So on a gaming space, for example, you can see the sandbox, the Decentralands of the world being quite successful. But the game economies themselves, have they actually found balance for good engagement, right? Again, a community doesn't have to be the same size as what Web2 games have to be in order for it to sustain, right, by itself. That's the beauty of Web3, because it's all about communities, right? And the communities don't have to be in the millions or tens of millions for the game to sustain. That's the great part about that, right? But beyond gaming, you can sort of see, applications about other verticals, creative verticals, that would be super interesting about music, for example. One thing that I get very excited about is education, right? Because with TinyTap, the acquisitions we've made, what we've essentially done was look at what is the fundamental premise of education industry, right? We understand that teachers ultimately are it's actually one of the most important occupations in the world, right? But they're probably one of the least well paid, or even, shall we say, fairly paid, right? So what we've tried to do is that using their creativity on a no-code basis, have them create these NFTs, which are courses, then get sold to co-publishers, where these teachers are seeing their creation sold for $60,000 to $100,000, $200,000 with a co-publisher, where you can actually now reach digitally to many, many different kids that you can then educate, right? We believe that would spark curriculum changes in the education sector, which really hasn't changed for a long time. So we believe that ownership component, that creativity component, arising even from a really good teacher. Imagine all the teachers that you had, and you remember a couple of them being really good to you, that has made a big difference. We're trying to enable and inspire those teachers to put some time in the creation of their own, to then own their creativity, own a piece of it, and perhaps earn an income that is more fair, in our opinion.
That would be a great use case to have, I guess. Marcel, from your point of view.
Hopefully this one works. There we go. So I think from my point of view, I agree with both of my amazing panelists here. My view, I'm going to put this much further into the future, which might sound a bit fantasy or science fiction, but I think the ideal goal here, at least what I'm excited about, is if one day every individual, every company can essentially either voluntarily or passively earn income on the data they generate just by doing whatever it is that they do. And I think that's a very powerful thing in sort of generating wealth for the global citizen. And I think that's a really interesting goal to strive for. And this is one of the reasons that got me passionate about blockchain in the first place.
That's great, and I think already in this space we're seeing already the first real-life use cases with Mercedes-Benz launching a blockchain-based data marketplace, exactly to untap this potential of data that is not used yet because it cannot be monetized, and also to tear down the walls of data monopolization that we have today. So final question for you guys. So if we meet next year on the same stage, same panel, what's your prediction looking back in hindsight then a year from now? What were the events that happened? What would have changed? How would the industry have grown further? Evan, if we maybe start with you.
Hello? Oh, there we go. Some mic problems today, huh? But anyway, I think the industry is going through ups and downs. And by the way, we have to look at the macro, right? The macro is that we had really about 14 years of easy money, right? So there's a lot of capital being chased on shall we say, projects that might not be well scrutinized, right? So that's what happens, and this happens in the non-crypto world, happens in the crypto world as well, and things go work through itself. But what remains, again, I'm very bullish on the sector because ultimately I'm looking at who's entering, right? With a traditional industry folks like myself, some of the panelists, some of you around here, that are kind of like, wow, this is really the future. And we sort of see that and more building infrastructure, applications, etc. It's very exciting. Some things will remain, some things won't, right? But what I would expect to see a year from now is that you see a couple more killer applications along different verticals. It could be education, right? It could be from any mocha brands. It might not be, right? It could be from the music industry. It might be from, for the gaming industry, a couple more of these, like maybe AAA titles that you and I talked about back in the lounge. The infrastructure side, you will see, I don't want to name names, but a couple of very interesting companies, including Luca, that would look to enable the space, and they'll grow, right, overall. So I believe that you might have fewer fragmentation, you may have some that are emerging as winners, but the space itself, I believe, will still be made of smaller companies because of the decentralized nature of it. But the premise and the ingredients for success will become a lot more clearer 12 months from now than the murkiness we might be experiencing today.
Great, interesting. Kinga.
Sorry.
There, it works now.
It does work? Okay, good. So just going back to the basics. So what I see here is that there's incredible amount of talent, and let's not forget about that came over to experiment with crypto. I think innovation is still there. As you said, VCs are still there. There's money coming in, but there's also crowdsourcing. The whole aspect of open source creates ideas, and ideas come from everywhere in the world. You don't need to be concentrated in the developed world. It can be anywhere. And there's a lot of young talent that came to the market, and I think the next year is going to be about building. There's going to be building interesting use cases like gaming and marketplaces, things that we haven't really even thought about. And in a more transparent way, I do think that the industry grew up over the past few months just by adopting more risk-mature standards and disclosures. And I think everyone's going to understand that we have to build with proper disclosures and innovate the right way and mature way. And I do think that's happening. And next year, I do expect a lot of those projects that are in the works right now. There's many, many, many of them. They're going to come to fruition. We're going to see interesting things and things that Evan was talking about that helps generally the ecosystem to evolve and helps people to take advantage of it.
Great, Basil. So Abu Dhabi Crypto 2023, what will we see looking back?
Well, I think for 2023, what I really hope to see is some very strong onshore regulation and support from the central bank to enable firms like ours to interact with the traditional financial services system, but also with non-financial corporates. I think it's very important that sort of the large corporates that provide many of the services that we know today play a role in the adoption of Web3, especially in the UAE.
Great, I think that's a fantastic outlook, whether it's a use case in data, whether it's education, whether it's more regulation or proper regulation, and I think most importantly, King, what you mentioned, an infrastructure that would allow us to avoid the mistakes maybe that happened over the past week, or that were exposed over the past week. Having said that, I would thank the audience so much for joining us today, and thank you to the panelists.